from my point of view, I stopped being a minister 8 months ago, and I don't suffer from relevance deprivation. I don't miss the trappings of office, but there has been something happening that I found quite strange. There haven't been a lot of people wandering around saying to me, "What a great idea," or "very perceptive," or "well said," or "great speech," which I've grown used to in the last 5 years. There'd always been a discordant note, of course, at home, where my boys used to say, "Dad, what would you know?" And my wife would always remind me, "You're not the minister around here, mate." I do miss what really was toadying, and some ministers like it, but I always was quite embarrassed by it. But I know that's part of the public servant's lot. Now, as Catherine said in introduction, each minister is different. I don't envy you the task of adapting to each minister. Some are more focused on your capacity to do a good travel bid. Others are deeply interested in policy. Others are perhaps more political than others in what they want from public servants. I think from my point of view, I was probably best known, for those of you old enough to remember, as a member of the Spanish Inquisition. I like to interrogate my public servants because I found getting public servants into the office and bouncing ideas off them and examining them and testing them was the best way for me to get a feel of the issues. Now, and I'm sure other ministers have completely different styles, and I think some officers would dread the submission coming back with "discuss" written in the column, because that was my standard response, and they knew then that they were going to have to come up and run the gauntlet of me trying to get to terms with the issue. But as I say, I know each minister requires different things from people and operates in different ways, and as I say, I don't envy you the task of adapting to that, and particularly when there's a revolving door of minister in the portfolio, which sometimes occurs. Look, as a general proposition, I think Australian public service is first rate. I think our Commonwealth Public Service is in the finest traditions of public service, and we attract talented, hard-working and honest public servants largely. And I think if you look at issues of corruption, etc., very low in Australia, and there's a lot to be proud of about our public sector. But there also are challenges, and obviously the performance is sometimes patchy. So I thought I'd concentrate on a few things that I think ought to be a bit of a focus. Firstly, I think the really emerging issue for us is question of accuracy and timeliness. The reality is the pace of being a minister has increased enormously, and the expectations of your ability to respond quickly have really gone up. I mean, Curtin used to take the train back while Prime Minister to Perth. If we haven't got an answer within 3 hours for a journo now, they write, "The Minister refused to comment," and they often ring you at 5 o'clock in the evening. So the ministers and their officers are under those sorts of pressures that have really ramped up in recent years. And the reality of the media cycle is they're under pressure to create or report more news more quickly. And that obviously then transfers as pressure back to the department. So timeliness, the capacity to be able to respond with accurate information quickly, I know is, I think, a real challenge for both ministers' offices and for the public sector. I think that's going to continue to emerge as the issue. My frustrations as a minister were largely based on whether we could get accurate information quickly out of the department. And I think sometimes our systems aren't well set up for that. And so from a minister's point of view, I think that's a classic. Now, clearly the information has to be right. The history of ministers falling or being totally embarrassed by presenting wrong information is a very long and honourable one. And one always enjoys it greatly in opposition at estimates. I remember giving Robert Hill, who was a very competent, hard-working minister, a terrible time over the allegations about Abu Ghraib and torture of prisoners there. And you could see Robert's face sort of getting more downcast as he began to hear new things as his officers were giving evidence. And of course, a lot of the advice given to him proved to be not correct, and it sort of rolled out over months, and he had a very difficult time in that regard. So ministers obviously want accurate information, and so I think the public services capacity to respond to that's very important. I think I just wanted to comment on a few things that I think we can do better. I think we've got to continue work at improving the capability of the public service. I have a real bugbear about the focus always on management and promoting people who are good managers and focusing always on that. I think at the expense sometimes of encouraging specialists, encouraging a broader range of skills, and providing promotional opportunities for people with more specialist skills. I think when I came into a ministry, I found the lack of specialist advice inside my department's research and policy capability to be a real weakness. And I think there were lots of people who were good generalists, but we perhaps weren't encouraging some of those specialist skills. And I think that's partly about how the sort of promotion systems works. It's partly this preoccupation that to be in the public sector of the Commonwealth level, you've got to live in Canberra. Quite frankly, some people don't want to live in Canberra, and I don't think we ought to deny ourselves the skills and the capabilities of those people if they're not prepared to live in Canberra. I had a particular issue in the industrial relations portfolio. Is quite frankly the industrial relations clubs in Melbourne. All the people who knew what they were talking about that we wanted to employ were in Melbourne, but we had this thing that they had to come to Canberra. Well, why? We let the secretaries commute. Why can't we have specialist skills in other states? With modern technology, I mean, Amanda and I used to commute, Amanda from Adelaide and me from Perth, but we couldn't possibly see our way clear to employing someone with a high skill base in Melbourne because it didn't fit into the team or to the structures that we had. I think that's a really limiting factor that I found very, very frustrating. We ought to be able to employ across Australia. We ought to be able to employ specialists. We ought to be able to broaden the range of advice inside the public sector. And for instance, in immigration, I created a role for an economist because we constantly, and I'm not a critic of the central agencies the way many ministers have been, but we didn't have the capacity to argue with them. We didn't have the expertise to actually take them on when they were wrong. And I brought in an economist, and I made sure he didn't manage anybody, that he actually gave specialist, very senior economists with specialist expert advice, rather than being lost in a team managing people and not being able to concentrate on his skill set. And I think if the departments in particular are going to be able to contribute to the policy debate, they've got to have those skills inside the departments. The other thing I'd say, because Catherine touched on it in her poll, is that I think it's really important that we try as much as possible to take middle range or relatively junior staff to briefings of ministers. I always found those that have been to briefings and to engage with the minister and their staff actually then produced work that was much more useful for the minister. They sort of got it. The penny dropped about what the office was after. So I was always encouraging the secretaries to bring relatively junior staff up or to engage them with my advisors, because I think we got a better product as a result. And I, quite frankly, used to encourage the senior public servants not to talk all the time, but to actually let the officer who knew what they were talking about talk. Having the secretary try and bull dust artists is not really my way of getting information. You actually wanted the officer who knew their stuff if you wanted to get a deeper understanding. So I think improving our capability, being less driven by the sort of management structures and this thing about always having people who could only succeed in public service if they're managing a team and getting that experience is important. And I think that and being better at the linkages with the not-for-profit sector and academia. I very rarely got submissions which showed any understanding of the work done by academics. and very little of the work done by other public sectors. I mean, generally, there's no such thing as a new idea. Someone's tried this before. I didn't think we were very good at saying, well, we've seen the Canadians and they really buggered this up and we shouldn't try it ourselves. So I didn't get a lot of advice like that. Bit of a tendency to say, yes, Minister, I know you went to the election with that policy. It's a really brilliant idea. We'll have a crack at it. Knowing that 3 other Democratic governments had tried it and it failed. You do want to hear that stuff. You do want to know that before you go down that path. Which I suppose comes to the question of, sort of frank and fearless advice. The other thing I think I would have appreciated more of from the public sector is an honest response to whether you can deliver. Sometimes because we've asked for too much from a department, sometimes because we don't have the capability inside the department to deliver what's been asked, or sometimes that experience elsewhere has shown that it's not best delivered by the public sector. I think that hard-headed appraisal of our capabilities, the department's capabilities, ministers would appreciate more of, and I think there's a tendency for people not to give you that feedback. And I think, I certainly would have appreciated more of that. I'll just say something about fearless and frank advice. I think that is getting increasingly difficult. I think I'm sad to say, but I've become someone who's less keen on FOI legislation and some of the restrictions of that than I was before being a minister. And I haven't changed now that Labor's gone into the opposition. I think it's starting to really, the sort of disclosure regimes, the freedom of information regimes, quite frankly, the development of a leaking culture has seen public servants, ministers be concerned about receiving fearless and frank advice, at least on paper, and I think that's a worrying trend. And if you see the red and blue books now, they're basically the annual reports. I mean, everyone knows they're going to be FOI'd, everyone knows they're going to be all in the paper. So now they're the most bland, useless document for a minister you've ever seen. And you read the document, and then the secretary comes in and says, well, really, Minister, actually, there's 3 things that are going to blow up next week, but they're not actually in the red or blue book. So I think there is a real issue for us about how we provide advice. And increasingly, I found myself relying on verbal advice because of the demands. Don't get me wrong, demands of FI and other things. Don't get me wrong, I'm not arguing for secrecy, but if you want options that may be controversial, you've got to be able to have those conversations inside the minister's office, and the minister's got to be able to talk to other ministers about them before they read about them on the front page of the newspaper, because then you can't have a sensible discussion about them. So I think that's an issue we've got to grapple. I suppose the other thing that I just wanted to mention, that I do accept that a lot of the issues here are driven by politicians. I think machinery of government changes should be made much harder for governments. This is not a criticism of the current government. I actually think the start they made on that was a better one. I thought my government never did that very well. At one stage I couldn't remember my title. I had to check the letterhead. It was about that long, and it was a different name to the department. But everyone was happy because everyone got a Guernsey. Skills, science, tertiary education, everyone got a Guernsey. But we had to get. We were thinking about going to A3 rather than A4 to fit it on. But the disruption caused by some of the machinery government changes is enormous. You all spend 6 months worrying about your jobs. Or organising for the computer systems to be changed, or moving offices, etc., and the loss of productivity and the disruption's enormous. And I think we ought to make it harder for politicians to make machinery government changes. And I think, I operated in one stage where we had 5 ministers in a portfolio. It's just impossible for the department. I understand we made very silly decisions in that regard. I think the other thing we can do better is I think we can train ministerial advisors much better to understand the restrictions on the public sector, what they can and can't do, what officers are allowed to do and not allowed to do. I think better understanding about ministerial advisors about about their relationship with departments would be really important. I think a number of them don't do well at that, and often it's just because they don't know. But the other thing I'll finish on this, sorry it's a bit disjointed, but the other thing I think we could really do much better is develop our talent inside the public sector. I don't think we're good at allowing people to grow at the lower levels of the public sector or to do meaningful work which stimulates them, and I think we lose a lot of them. Over the years I had a reasonable number of people come in from the departments to work for me, many of them at EL1, EL2 level. I don't know what that means anymore. I'm the old class 1 to 8 person. I haven't learnt the new metrics. But relatively junior officers who had tremendous capabilities, did work at a much higher level in the ministerial office, were prepared to work really hard, etc., and were then really frustrated when they had to go back to the department where they didn't have enough work and weren't challenged. Now, I accept the ministerial office is a different environment, but I think sometimes the systems don't allow us to get the best out of the talent we've got available to us because of the reporting mechanisms and the systems in place, and I certainly would like to see us do better out of using the talent that we do have available, because as I say, I think we tend to rely too much on too few at the top and don't utilise enough the skills of the rest of the sector. But anyway, from my broad point of view, I think the public service in Australia does it pretty well. As always, we have to change and adapt and do better. And in terms of the relationships with ministers, I accept 90% of the blame is ours. Thank you.
I had Stockholm Syndrome and I got over it. I fell in love with my captors. I loved my job, every minute of it. However bad it was, however much, what hit the fan, I loved it. But now that I'm out of it, there's not a nanosecond I've wanted to go back. And I can't explain that. How can you love something so much and then not want to go back? And the answer, of course, is Stockholm Syndrome. And it's nice not to have the same experience as Chris has with your partner at home saying, look, you're not the bloody minister around here. And family and sometimes friends saying, yeah, just because you're a minister doesn't mean you can... And people do it so unfairly, you're a sitting duck. Anyway, I think one of the most important things to mention about having the opportunity to serve as a minister in the Australian Federal Parliament is the tremendous privilege of working with the senior levels of the Australian Public Service. I mean, what a dream. Here are bright and talented people who know a truckload, and you get to work with them simply because you got elected and simply because your leader decided you could have this particular portfolio. And look, I hesitate to mention a couple because by and large, everyone I worked with was really good. There are always exceptions, you never forget them, but it seemed churlish to mention them. But some of you may remember, I don't know, there's a guy called Lionel Woodward that Chris Schott, the then Customs Minister, Labor Minister, appointed. He was in charge of Customs. He was a fabulous guy to work with. Mick Palmer, who was the Federal Police Commissioner, who I don't only believe, I know took the Federal Police to being a much better and bigger international organisation. Sue Varden, who I know is here today, who took over Centrelink when two female ministers had the brains to put social security and the employment aspects together. And Andrew Metcalfe, who was, for most of my time as immigration, the Secretary of Immigration. I'll just mention these, there'll be others, but people who you get to know, who you trust, whose word you would absolutely believe, and who have one magical quality: they get it bloody done. And if there's a problem, they let you know about it in advance and work out how to handle it. I think that's the exemplar of a good way to do it. Government, of course, gets the opportunity under the democratic system, that's how it works, to say we've decided we want to go from A to B, or to C or D or wherever. And you poor so-and-sos have to help us get there, even if you know that's not a good place to go. Sometimes, as Chris said, it's a good thing to say, look, it's great policy. I know other people who think that. loonies, here are a few things you might like to know before you step right in. So it's a sense of us, if you look at it in the political sense, saying we want to go there, and you guys mapping out the alternative routes to get there and the alternative forms of transport that you might use, and then working together to get there. Can I say one of the reasons I mentioned working with the senior levels of the public service is, you know, however much money you've got, there is a point at which more money won't make you happier. That might be a different level for everybody, but there is a point at which it won't. And what will make you happier in your job, one of the key factors that is the quality of the people you get to work with. And so for every minister to have that opportunity to work with some of the best and brightest minds on public policy in Australia is indeed a real privilege. Now, why do I say work with the senior levels as if the juniors don't matter? Well, no, actually I share some of Chris's views here. Some of the seniors don't want you to get to know the people under them. I found that when briefs would come up and, you know, have at the bottom, I think it's prepared by or contact officer or something, I'd ring the person who prepared it. And often they were quite shocked. Oh, you sort of could see them stunned, knowing what to, because I want to know about this graph. Where did you get this? How did you put this together? You know, what are the other figures in the further years this way or that way? And often you'd find you'd think anyway, that they'd invented some excuse to get off the phone, like, do you mind, I'm just in a meeting, I'll ring you back in a couple of minutes. And you think, yeah, go and get your papers, try and work it out. But then we realised what they were doing is going to tell the person above them. Because if they took a call from the minister and the person above didn't know, they might be in trouble. So then the person above would ring. And sometimes they were really dumb. Because they didn't know anything about the graph anyway. But more to the point, they'd try and pretend it was just an occasional call. Oh, hello, is there anything I can do for you? So we just decided it was a stupid game ministers play. I mean, you know, you have a lot of fun in these jobs sometimes, so you've got to have a bit. So we'd say, no thanks, everything's fine. And you can say, shit, let me just say that. Nothing you want to know about such and such? Nothing I haven't already set in train. Right. What have you said in train? Well, I've spoken to somebody in the department about getting blah blah, because they know all this. They just don't want to say, I'm ringing you because I don't want you talking to people under me without me knowing. I share Chris's view about, well, put it this way, in your life, if you've ever been given a helping hand, consider how you ought to do that for the people below you. If you've been the beneficiary, don't be a so-and-so and not do the same for people under you. The young people will lift you up to greater heights. The better the people are under you, the more you let the light shine on them, the better you look. It's a selfish reason for doing it, but it works. In answer to the short answer to the question, how good are you at policy responses? My answer is exactly the same as Chris's. Generally, you are exemplars. You're just fantastic at it. It's tremendous. I mean, governments like to say, well, public service is there to serve the government of the day. Well, that's right. I don't often hear the next sentence, and we couldn't do anything without them. It's sort of, you are there to serve the government of the day, but it is a partnership. We just can't do it without you. You have all the access to knowledge, institutional memory, experts in policy design for choices to make. You can really open up the world, especially to new ministers, with the opportunities that are there for different policy design. And probably one of the best experiences I had was a very early one. People rang me when I was in Deacher and said, you want to get rid of this bloke? He's a Labor bastard. And I thought, well, that's a bit funny. We thought that you shouldn't pick on people because of their politics. You know, we always complain if Labor picks on a Liberal person. So I thought, we'll just give this a run and see how we go. And thank God I had the sense to do that. Thank God, because this guy was a genius. I think you call them decision trees. See, don't forget, I've been put in this portfolio. I might be being unkind to Mr Howard saying this, but I think it's because they knew they had lots of savings to find and didn't care if it killed me. So, you know, don't put a good mate there, that person might get killed. I hadn't had a background in that portfolio either. And this guy's a genius. He came up and said, look, there are 4 ways you can find this type of money. Here they are, I just want to talk to you for about half an hour, just get your head around these 4 choices. Come back tomorrow and you can tell me if any of those are no-goes. So we went through them, I can't remember exactly, but a couple of them said, well, they definitely won't do, we're not doing those. Let's just focus on these. Come back tomorrow with some more choices under each of the remaining choices. And you could see by digging down a bit that another one would get peeled off and couldn't go. Now, this guy's a card-carrying member of the Labor Party. He used to joke with me about sitting down on a 3-way conversation with Beazley and Keating arguing about something, I don't know. And he gave, well, that was probably my first introduction to top-class advice. And I think that's how it needs to be offered. So, what can you do better? No point in me coming along today and highlighting the things where they went wrong because of the public service. Ministers tend to remember them, you know, they're sort of little bit of grudge bits in your heart that you're not meant to have, but you're just a lying so-and-so if you don't admit that you do remember them, because they're very painful experiences. But I think because the vast majority, we're talking up in the 90-something%, are just fabulous public servants, then the best I can do is tell you how I think you could improve. One is to understand that the appropriation a department gets is not equivalent to a business's gross sales. I had a secretary make this mistake to me one day. They were sitting next to a business person who said, discussion, what do you do? I run this company, turnover of such and such. And the secretary said, I run a business with a turnover of that much. And my heart sank. I thought, no, you don't. You don't compete for those dollars out on the fickle market that likes Hungry Jack's one day and McDonald's the next. Your appropriation is not gross sales. But you have a complicated life because you're expected to run a department like a business in terms of management and your costs. And I think one of the best things that public servants could do, especially in service delivery areas, but across all areas, and anything you do, is say to yourself, would this pass the private sector test? Because what you'll be doing if you ask yourself that question is adding. I'm not saying copy them. God, they do some dreadful things. But if you take on your institutional knowledge, your policy design knowledge, all the things the public service has got, and you just add a little bit of icing, what would the private sector say about this? And then you understand what they say, and you understand what the response might be. I think the building education revolution, covered learning area thing, was an example, maybe where a government demanded things, I don't know, but where it wasn't clear that anyone understood what happens when you put big buckets of money out to get it out the door quickly to a limited number of contractors. You end up with some covered learning areas costing 3 or 4 times what they really should. So I think that's the best piece of advice. Just ask yourself, would this pass the private sector test in everything? The other suggestion I'd have is to always offer a real choice. Coming back to the public servants that I mentioned and all the others that were really good. Part of what makes them good is you trust them. That means you can work with them. Trust is essential. So when you send up briefs that have got, say, 3 choices, I'd like to go from A to B. Well, there's 3 choices. A, you'll probably get killed because the plane will crash. B, the railway lines aren't safe and the railway will probably be derailed. C, hire a car, perfectly safe, blah, blah, blah. That is not giving you choices. That's the public service saying, we don't want you to choose A and B, so we're listing all the bad things, we're putting warnings in there in case any of this is FOI'd or gets out, and you look a complete dill for picking other than the one we wanted. You might get away with that type of brief every now and then, but your minister will not trust you. They'll be deeply suspicious from then on. Another thing I think needs to be borne in mind by some, I don't want to name who, see if you can figure it out. Some departments, not the service delivery ones, because they really do know where the rubber hits the road, and sometimes maybe in a service delivery department, some public servants and some departments, whole departments, have a culture that they are to protect Australia's interest in this area. We know what's best in this area. And those morons that get elected, that come in and out every now and then on the wave of that crude thing called an election, oh, we have to go through, we have to explain it to them, we have to get them to understand this is the best way, and really see themselves as superior to the elected government of the day. Now, that is a very ugly route to go down, but there are one or two departments who have that view. And it permeates all the way. No, if I tell that story, you'll know which department I'm thinking of. But, you know, there are public servants who really do believe in their job, that they know better, and this guy or girl is just an idiot, because they don't, in that area, because they don't know as much, and if only they'd listen to us, everything would be better. If you have that view, get out of the public service and get yourself elected to Parliament, get in there in the scrum of ideas and argue it out with the public. A no-no, something you should never do, is keep the minister in the dark. I think Chris has touched on this, giving them options, be perfectly frank, be perfectly honest. And I had two experiences in immigration that were vastly different, and they relate very much to, well, they were different in themselves substantively, but also different in how the public service handled them. One was Cornelia Rao, who had some mental health issues, let's put it that way. And the other was Mrs. Alvarez Solon. Cornelia Rao was perfectly explicable. She was telling the truth when she said, I'm a German citizen. She just forgot to mention that she was an Australian resident under another name. She didn't want to be who she was. And while there were errors made in her file, no doubt about that, that was all explicable, and I would not blame the department for her being in detention as long as she was. And, you know, neither would you if you were the mug that had to make those decisions. How are we to expect people in immigration to conclude that someone has a mental health problem when they've been to a mental health facility and sent back as being okay? Sometimes we ask too much, or the public expects too much. But to the extent the department could give us answers quickly, she'd been in a number of states and the files were everywhere, so it wasn't easy, they did. Alvarez Solon was an entirely different matter. The mistake was discovered not long after it happened, and it was covered up. There were people who knew, and they shut up about it. Worse, I think, although equally bad, might be a better way to describe it, when the department started looking at it, they did have information, but I can assure you they didn't give to their minister when they knew the minister was having to front, you know, late line and those other sorts of things. That is unforgivable. That's when you lose trust. That's when you go to the Prime Minister and say, I can't work with one or two of these people. This is what happened. So the rule of the day is, if you expect us to trust you, and you should because you're sitting on this mine of information, then you've got to trust us as well. I've covered the point about looking at the government's agenda, not yours, but I'll give you a different example than one I was thinking of earlier. When I was in Rome, I thought it'd be a great idea if we had a story on Penny Wong in one of the magazines, sort of a cross between the Fin Review and Australian magazine, like the Wish magazine or something. Not a girly job. And I was very pleased about this, having gone up to Milan and talked them into this. No, don't do the Prime Minister. Everyone does new Prime Minister stories. That's boring. You know, this person exemplifies Australia. She's a Chinese Malaysian, grown up into taking this job, very important job environment, blah, blah, blah. Literally had someone come and say to me, don't you think you should have checked with Images of Australia before you offered her that interview? I said, what? Images of Australia? You know, it's a branch in DFAT. And they're sort of in charge of our image overseas and what interviews people do. I said, well, you know, when I'm to school, I was told that we sort of elect the government, they're the government, and they decide what they want to do, and she's a cabinet minister, and I think she'd go spare if she thought that any department thought they should have a veto over whether she's offered an interview. I mean, give me a break. Never, you already know, when you send up those Friday briefs and you want a decision Monday, you're cactus. You're never going to be trusted again. My favourite question was, or two, how long have you been working on this? When did this file first originate? Well, months ago. And what happens if I don't do it Monday? No one really wants to answer that. Let me finish by coming to Frank and Fearless. I don't think we get it either, I agree. But part of the reason we don't get it is we get it at the top. The department, a pyramid, decides what is the best advice to give the government. And if you're somewhere underneath and you have a different view, it won't get through. Now, this isn't easy to manage because ministers don't want 60 public servants with different advice all ringing up saying, I don't agree with that. You can't have that. That's Rafferty's rules. But there are departments who are so pyramidal in their operation and so serving the top of the department rather than the government. Departments where you need not just a mentor but a patron to get on, that anyone will say what the person above them wants. I can't tell you how disheartening it is to have a deputy head of mission in Rome say, well, I'll be ringing Canberra tonight. What for? Oh, well, because then I'll find out what they want us to say. Hold on. Why are you living in a flat on Campo de Fiori? Why am I in, aren't we meant to tell them what we think? And it's all the pyramidal business that is a problem. Last but not least, here's how I reckon you can help yourselves. Get somebody to figure out how you can get rid of the duds. Why should terrific people like you, why should you have to work with eggheads? If you've got someone that's a trouble cause, they've got a personality, sort of not disorder, but on the edge of that, a permanent trouble causer, or lazy, shiftless, who's lost their enthusiasm, why should good people have to work with them? I think we have to find out a way to clear those people out and let the best of the public service really shine. And I conclude by saying, and one way to do that is give the young people a chance. They will really lift you up. Thanks.
Chris and Amanda, thank you both so much. At this point, I would like to invite questions from the floor.
You can have a revenge for Senate estimates.
That's right. Exactly.
Probably the last decade for both governments, there's been, some people have commented that there's been a deterioration in public sector bargain between ministerial and bureaucrat responsibility when things go wrong. And I was wondering if you might make a comment around that, as a minister, how do you find the accountability when things went wrong in that media attention?
Do you want to go first or well, look, I had a range of experiences with that. You probably already know that every now and then the media operating as a pack decides a minister has to go. And when they decide that, they're relentless in picking up the most minor error and pursuing it endlessly. So what Chris said about needing the right information and needing it quickly to respond to that is very important. Now look, as to where the responsibility lies, I think the old idea of any mistake in a department, you lose your minister, is crazy. I think the minister's job is to fix things up, try and do that, working with the department to do that. In immigration, for example, once we had Cornelia, we had an inquiry. We thought that would never happen again. Then when we found Alvaro Solon, the penny dropped. This could be a lot bigger than that. So we had a big inquiry. It wasn't welcomed by a lot of people, but I think immigration was better for it in the end. And we cleaned it up. No minister wants to be the sitting duck saying, oh, I didn't think it happened once, didn't think it happened twice, I'll just sit here and wait till the next one comes out. You've got to clean it up. I've already canvassed how I think the department handled those two things differently. I think the most shocking thing to me was over some small matter that did get blown up early on. And a particular public servant came to me and said, look, I'd like to accept responsibility for what happened. I saw how it was a bit tense actually, because I'd been beaten up in the paper about this. How are you going to do that? I'm telling you now, I accept responsibility. Oh, joke. It's just a joke. So I do think departments have to work out a way. Centrelink does it through a guy called Hank Yongan. He is a spokesperson for the department and can handle lots of things. And I do think there are points at which the department can, through a spokesperson, explain what's happened. And then that allows the media to see whether the minister is responsible or not. Where you are responsible, you've got to wear it. But the media being a bit outdated in their understanding of how ministerial responsibility has developed will try and ping you, even if something happened, like 2 or 3 ministers ago, you're the bunny sitting in the seat. But the best thing you can do is take Chris's advice and in helping the minister respond to that, and that's do it quickly and fully openly, telling them everything you know and getting it right. Because a wrong answer to a query, it's often not what went wrong that takes a minister out, it's a wrong answer to what went wrong that does it.
Yeah, just 2 points in response. I think the last point of Amanda is dead right. It's never the cock up that gets you, it's the cover up. But I used to preach that to every senator or Senate leader, and it was ignored largely by most of them. But if you say I buggered it up, it usually goes away. People accept that. If you try and cover it up, then you've got a major problem. But the other, very few people try and cover up per se. But that's why it's important that we have the right information, because quite frankly, if the minister gives the wrong information, the assumption is it's a cover-up, whereas always you can generally rely on the fact that it's a cock-up rather than a cover-up. So I think that is important. I think to your question, though, I think I regard it as the most important relationship in being a minister was between my chief of staff and the departmental secretary. That is absolutely vital relationship to making it work. And I know my chief of staff spent a lot of time making sure that they and the secretary were, knew what each other was doing, were able to manage it. And I think because the Ministerial Office does do more than it used to, they are involved more broadly than perhaps they were a couple of decades ago. So having that very strong linkages is really important. The question of who to blame is another issue, but if you don't have that working well, then the whole thing breaks down.
We have some fantastic questions that have actually been typed in from the floor as well, so I'll pick up a couple of those. There are 2 that have come in that are related, so I'll posit them both. And they're related to the 24/7 news cycle. So the 2 separate questions are, why do we have to respond to the media when they want? And what do you think the government can do to reduce the pressure of a 24/7 news cycle? Either of you like to play with that?
Well, you're the media star, so you
I don't know that. I am the presenter of Counterpoint, but as I say to the ABC and they get a bit upset, there's only 4 dogs and 2 cats listening, Radio National doesn't have a big audience, but it has a very diverse one. Look, I think you're seeing the current government try to change that. And there's a lot of pushback from the media about this, saying, when the government says, no, we're not going to give you this information 24/7, you can have it, but not 24/7. There are arguments about how well that's being managed, but I don't think there's any argument that change shouldn't happen. I don't know whether the media realise that when they ask a question and then they come back and ask a minor variation of it, that it goes to a department, and then there are people rabbiting around who, if it had been handled in a more considered way, wouldn't have to rabbit around twice to get another version of that answer. So I think governments can control that by in various ways, by trying not to feed the 24/7 cycle. On the other hand, one of the ways the coppers got more money was when I said to them, look, the reason pardon me, eating while I'm talking, it's disgusting, isn't it? I'm eating a minty, I'm sorry. I said, nobody knows what you do. When you go and say you want more money, and the Prime Minister says, well, what do? You've got to fill their minds, the whiteboard, with federal police stuff. So we got to the point that we would let the Prime Minister's office know if him actually, not his whole office, especially not the media person, we expected a big drug bust in the next week. They have to build a tremendous level of trust between the federal police and you to be able to do that. And then we had it psyched up. We'd let him know, someone would let him know, 6 o'clock in the morning, it happened last night. We'd be on the radio at 6. This is not 24/7, this is every minute of the day. And if you're on there by 6 in the morning, you've got a press release prepared and done, you get 6, 6:30, 7, 7:30, 8, 8:39, and then it goes to more hourly news services. Then you can wheel in the guys in the uniforms at lunchtime and carry it on till the night time. By then you've got some further information. You've got a whole day cycle filled up with the coppers. And honestly, you can have a look at it, their money just went up. So I don't think we should give in and dance to the media's tune. We should try and make them dance to our tune. I mean by that ours, us the politicians with you together.
Yeah, lovely, thank you.
Just one point, I think I blame John Howard because he made himself too available. He did fantastic in the sense he did talkback radio day after day in every state, and it changed the culture to the point, or helped change the culture where people expect the Prime Minister and every minister to be able to answer every question instantaneously. And the reality is you can't do that. You can't give informed responses on the run all the time. And if you look at our politicians in this country, we are more accessible to the media and scrutiny than any other democracy I've come across. I think Barack Obama does a press conference about once a month. British politicians rarely do talkback radio. We have senior ministers on talkback radio, 3 or 4 of them a day. And there's a good side of that about accessibility, etc. But I think the downside is that it's helped dumb down politics, and it's had a focus that's helped drive the sort of 24-hour news cycle. I mean, people, you get asked to respond to what some backbencher said at the doors in the morning, and you don't even know who they are, and why the bloody hell should you, Like if one of them said something stupid, well, that's up to them to explain, But it just feeds and feeds and feeds. I don't know what the answer is. It's a good question, but I think it actually has helped dumb down the process as well, which is the other side of it. But moving to 24-hour news TV, for instance, I think has had a huge impact. And I know when I went to India to explain when we had the student issues in Australia, violence against Indian students, they've got about 50 24-hour news channels. So they all compete to be more outrageous. So, I got questions like, why are you killing Indians, Minister? Seriously, and because they were competing in this market now. So there are issues with the media that are very hard to manage, but I think I don't agree with what's happening in terms of the border security stuff, but I think the Prime Minister's attempt to sort of not feed all the time the media machine is not a bad idea.
One of the explanations for Howard doing that, and I used to do some media that, like Good News Week, you think, why'd you do that? Because it's very risky doing that sort of thing with that. What's another woman who's very risky to go on with? Oh, anyway, it doesn't matter. Elle McFeast, that's right. And someone said to me, why the hell do you do that? I said, look, if I just rely on what the press galleries say about me, I'm going to be a demon. I have to take every opportunity I can to let normal Australians see a real person. And that's why Howard did it, because he knew the press gallery hated him, so he just went to talkback radio and spoke to real people that way. So that might be a problem that has a causal link in the press gallery in Canberra.